Mention the words Francis Albert Sinatra, you're talking, of course, about one of the superstars, not just of America, but of the world. And what I loved about Frank Sinatra, was the fact that when he said this famous line, "May the last voice you ever hear be mine." I think he truly meant that, don't you? But now, if you're a fan of Sinatra, let me tell you, there's something spectacular opening later this year in the very heart of the United Kingdom. As ever, let me explain. Hi, good morning, Neil Sean here. Nice to have your company, and I hope you're all keeping well, fine and dandy. Yes, Francis Albert Sinatra really was a one-off, wasn't he, And this particular brand new show is going to be, I believe, rather spectacular. It's a brand new production, features all the hit songs, but it's more than that because it's actually a celebratory sort of account of 70 years since Frank Sinatra arrived in the United Kingdom for his very first tour way back in 1953. And I was lucky enough to meet many of the people that were associated with that particular tour. He popped up in places like Elephant and Castle. That's right. And the manager of that particular cinema at the time told me a wonderful story. And when you think about it, now, I mean, he's a famous producer called Johnny Hamp, who went on to have many successful TV series with the likes of the comedians Wheel Tappers and Shunters. And he pointed out that, Frank really couldn't believe it wasn't a sellout because at that point in his career, he wasn't doing spectacularly well. There is an unsort of, shall we say, solicited recording of Frank's appearance at the Winter Gardens in Blackpool. And once again, I was lucky enough to meet the guy that looked after him in Blackpool during that time, drove him around. Apparently, Frank wanted to buy one of the very first, famous Blackpool trams. Stayed at a hotel, couldn't believe the crowds, but sadly the crowds were not coming out for him. That's right, it's hard to imagine this now, isn't it? But 1953, he was yet to hit it big once again with a spectacular performance with Montgomery Clift and the rest in From Here to Eternity. This new musical, as I say, will look at all facets of Frank's life. And as I've told you in a previous video, I was lucky enough also to meet one of Frank's wives, Ava Gardner, who gave me a real insight into what made the Magic Man tick himself. Finally, I have to say that I was lucky enough to meet, albeit very briefly, Frank Sinatra Jr., who famously was kidnapped way back in the early 1960s. This was in the latter part of his career, possibly a couple of years, sadly, before we lost him, and he was appearing in a very low-key event at Ronnie Scott's club in Soho in London. He didn't really want to do interviews or anything like that, so I was really thrilled, at least, just to get to meet him. He didn't feel he looked his best, so naturally he didn't want to have a picture, as one could imagine. But he gave me an insight into what made his father one of the greats. And he simply said he sang the songs from the heart. He looked at the lyrics, and if they resonated with him, then of course, he realized they would resonate with the audience. Again, as I say, in this wonderful career that I've been lucky enough to have, I've met many different people. Chris Riddle was a man, his father Nelson Riddle created many of the big hits for Frank Sinatra, and he told me over numerous interviews many of the insights and of course the tricks that Frank did to make sure his recording stood out. But who did Frank Sinatra rate himself? Well, he basically said there was only one woman in his mind who was show business from the tips of her toes to the top of her hair. And that was none other than Judy Garland. He said when he performed with Judy, you really had to watch everything because she stole the lights, the stage, the curtains, literally everything. To him, she was the ultimate professional. As I say, Sinatra the musical, I'm not quite sure whether it'll ever make it over to Broadway or indeed tour the world, but if you are in the United Kingdom later this year, it's definitely going to be one to watch. I'm not associated with it. I've not got any investment in it. I just like to share these things with you because, as I say, when you've met people associated with them, it's marvellous, isn't it, to think, wow, I wonder if they'll include that particular gem of a story that I was lucky enough to be parted with, having met people so closely associated with literally Old Blue Eyes himself.